This is the conversation with Dan Mueller. Hi, Dan.
Hello. Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Doing well, all things considered. How are you?
Doing all right? Maybe we'll start by you telling a little bit about yourself and what you do.
This is always an interesting question. I wear a lot of different hats, so it's never just a one word answer, but I feel like that speaks to my life experience as well, perhaps. I am in community empowerment, as I like to put it. I work with different nonprofits in the San Diego area on things like development, strategic planning. Most of the projects that I take on are in food farming or sustainability. Um, I have been I've been freelancing in that way over the last 2 years, and then have settled into a larger position with Grid Alternatives, which is a nonprofit solar and workforce development organization here in San Diego, which has been really great. I helped start the Urban Sustainability Coalition, which is aimed at educating community members on climate change and ways that they can be a part of the solution. I chair the Slow Food Board here in San Diego, which, as I was saying before, Slow Food is international grassroots nonprofit that stands for good, clean, fair food for all. I also have a position with Slow Food USA, where I develop projects in California, again, working with food and with farmers. I do a little bit of modeling. I do a little bit of writing. I am an assistant to a local jazz poet. I'm a Jill of all trades, and that's kind of how it's always been for me. So it's hard to say just one thing that I do. And then also, growing up as a mixed race woman, as a Black woman, as a biracial woman, these are all ways that I identify myself. I'm situated between two worlds. So I've had the job of the task and the role of communicating between and across racial lines. And I think that's probably what inspired me to study intercultural communication during my undergraduate. And I did my capstone research in intergroup dialogue and ways that we can talk about race and talk about ethnicity and talk about gender in a way that we can all ideally, hopefully, create a shared meeting and a shared understanding of how we experience the world.
This is great. Thank you for that.
It's a lot.
No, this is awesome. Maybe you can tell a little bit more about your family and about you growing up. And then maybe how did you perceive race when you were a kid, and how has that evolved?
My mother is white. My father is Black. I was taken into legal custody by my grandparents from a very young age. I was ill. My grandparents took legal custody of me to be able to have me on their health insurance and allow me to get the care that I needed. And so my grandparents are my mom's parents. So my grandparents are white. And so I grew up with them in a small white farming community in Southern Illinois. And, my grandmother and my grandfather told me about the way people approached them and the way people talked to them about having me, about raising me. And it wasn't so explicit and it wasn't so dramatic that I understood from those conversations how it was that others viewed me. It actually took getting into college and having a class in which I could unpack all of my experiences to really say, okay, this is who I am. This is how my social circumstances have impacted the way that I view myself. And it was through these classes that, we were asked to share something that really stood out to us in understanding our racial identity. This specific class was focused on race and ethnicity, intergroup dialogue. And I sat there and took a moment in silence and reflected on it. And I had a very, very clear moment of when I realized that I was different from everyone. I was
You said it was in college?
No, it was so this was in kindergarten.
Oh, kindergarten. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
it
Okay,
wasn't
okay.
until college that I was provided the opportunity to reflect on it. Right.
Okay, I see. Okay, tell me
Yes.
more about the kindergarten experience.
Yes. So here we go. I'm in kindergarten. It's a K through third grade building. The kindergarten bathroom was being cleaned or whatever, so I actually had to go down to the third grade bathroom, which felt strange because it wasn't what we were supposed to do. So it was already a little bit of an odd situation. And I'm using the restroom, and I see a ponytail flick underneath the stall. And these two girls, I can hear them talking, and the one says, I'm going to kick that brown girl's butt.
Gosh.
And I was confused. I thought they were talking about someone else, because surely that couldn't have been me. I'd been raised up to that point, so loved by my family and friends, never, who never either noticed the difference or pointed out the difference. I mean, I had one other mixed race friend growing up. Um, and that's really it. And it was us two basically in the town, maybe with like a handful of other people of color.
And that's all in Illinois, right?
That's in Illinois. Yes.
Southern
Southern
suburban
Illinois.
Illinois. Okay.
Yep. And
Rural Illinois, right? Okay.
rural Illinois.
Yeah.
And so, I finish up, I wash my hands, and I leave. And there's sort of an archway between the third grade wing and the rest of the school. And as I'm walking through, someone tries to get my attention. And as I turn to look, the other girl kicked me down. And I fell to my knees in the hallway. They laughed, ran away. And I was just in shock. I couldn't believe, well, one, I was now the brown girl. And I never viewed myself that way before. Two, someone wanted to perpetrate violence against me because I was brown. So and I'm not recognizing this at the time. I'm just so embarrassed and I'm so ashamed. And I pick myself up, I dust my knees off, and I run back to my kindergarten classroom, and I sit down, and I don't tell anybody about what happened, because I was so ashamed that it happened to me. And I was so confused as to why it happened, because up until that point, like I said, that is the defining moments of where I realized.
You didn't even talk to your grandparents?
No, I didn't even tell my, so my grandmother and I have a very special relationship. And I wasn't able to talk to her about it for years, not until maybe high school or junior high.
So tell me, what was your experience after that at that school, at that kindergarten and that school?
Sure. So first grade was really when you got to start integrating and having recess and free periods with the other age groups at the school. And almost immediately, I started being bullied or harassed. There was a woman, or a girl rather, who would hit me and my friend. So my best friend was a curly-haired, very tall. We were both very tall, ginger. So we both stood out in our own way. And during recess time and free periods, we would be spit on, have our hair pulled. People would hit us with jump ropes. And when we'd approach the teacher about it, or the monitor, she would just say, "Oh, we'll just ignore them. Like, it'll go away. Just ignore them." And, names like Blackie, Brownie, things that kids who have inherited racist ways of thinking from their parents might talk to someone who really I was friends, or so I thought, with this girl's cousin. She was in my class. We played together. I'd go to her house after school and in the summer, and then we'd go to school, and her cousin and her friend would do and say these things to me and my other friend. And the lack of response by admin really set the tone for just deal with it yourself. It's a personal problem, and you need to figure out what, how you're gonna deal with it. And I still remember, and it was in first grade that I met. There was a new kid in town, and he said, came up to me just plain as day. We'd sort of been becoming friends a little bit, and he said, what are the language rules here for this?
There are no rules.
There's no rules. Okay.
Yeah.
And he came up to me and he said, Danny, because I used to go by Danny when I was younger, you're not a nigger. And first grade, I still think I can't.
And did you hear that before?
That's the first time I remember it. That is the first time that I remember, and I can recall not every, but the instances that really get you and catch you off guard, I think. And he said, you're not a nigger, Danny. And I didn't know what that was. I had no idea what that was. And because I couldn't understand the gravity of it, I let it pass. And again, this was something that, as I'm reflecting, once I get to college or once I have the space to safely reflect, because that type of environment wasn't going to be the place to necessarily come into the understanding of my racial identity.
So basically, school administration pretended like either it wasn't happening or it wasn't racial. It was just, okay, I see.
Just the way it was.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And like, when did you start talking about any of this with your grandmother or your grandparents or with any other adults?
Any other adults? So there were, not until college, like I said, so I went to college just across the river in St. Louis University, and St. Louis is a cultural hub of sorts. It's a pretty diverse community. It's a very Black community. And like I said, I started studying intercultural communication and was then really given the vocabulary, right? I had the space to explore. I was given the vocabulary to communicate about my life and my experiences. And I found that a lot of other, Black, brown, mixed people had similar scenarios. And it wasn't until college, I think, that I really started saying, hey, this was my experience, and this is, what happened to me, to my grandparents or other adults or anywhere where that conversation could go somewhere. I wasn't able to formulate the thoughts really before then. I was still building my understanding.
Let me ask you this. How old were you when you realized, like consciously realized, that you're being mistreated for the way you look, for something you have absolutely no control of, and that's the reason?
Mm-hmm.
How old were you?
I have to look at it through my actions as much as I look at it, try to get back into that thought process. I started altering my appearance and making comments about my skin, I think probably in fourth or fifth grade. Fifth grade, I started getting relaxers in my hair to make my hair very straight, very sleek. And I definitely noticed a difference in, there were less comments about my hair. I felt more accepted. I felt like I had more friends. I felt myself starting to get, I don't know, like maybe more popular. I don't know if that's the right word. After I started doing all those things to change the way that I looked. So I would assume that it had to be, I don't have a clear moment where I'm like, oh, this is happening to me because of the way that I look. But once I started changing the way that I looked in my hair, the hair story is a whole story of its own. I definitely noticed a difference for sure.
Let me ask you this. Did you have any adults in your life at the time who you could talk to and who could explain to you what was going on and why was it going on and what's some of the ways to deal with that?
No, no, there would be moments, in history class, Black History Month, where teachers or adults might make comments about me not had the civil rights movement not happened, had, MLK is a very, easy figure to pull out for examples, for folks grappling with it, right? Had that not happened, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be in the classroom with them. I wouldn't be able to go to school with them. I wouldn't, probably wouldn't even be living in that community because, segregation and it still exists. These are not past problems, right? They still exist today, but I think that's part of the issue is thinking of it as a past thing. But that was very much the context in which it was talked about to me is, oh, had these things not happened, Danny wouldn't be here having these opportunities and having this experience.
So you were kind of almost singled out and okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you stayed at the same school
my whole life. They had, it was the same district, the same school district from kindergarten until I graduated high school. Yeah.
And was like, did anything change in high school?
So, high school was, and it's difficult to talk about. There's one instance, my sophomore year, where would have been my sophomore or junior year. We were doing a mock election. Obama was, running for president, and someone who was a great friend to me, we actually sat next to each other during class, said, white people have been running this country since it started, and white people should be the people who continue to run this country. And,
And that was who, sorry, who said that?
it was a friend. It was,
Gosh.
it was a friend of mine. We wrote
Like
he was in my friend crew. He was like
classmate?
Classmate. Yeah. And we would ride bikes together like every day. My grandmother and his mom were friends. And, and when his mom actually found out that he made that comment, she came over to my grandparents and, apologized and said, I don't really know where he, gets that way of thinking. And it was a bit of a shock. And our teacher really didn't even know how to address it. And I had to speak up. And I found myself in that position over the years quite a bit of maybe someone making a comment that is like deeply rooted in racism or some ism or, some form of bigotry. And then I have to speak up and say, oh, well, actually, and it wasn't even that I called the statement out as problematic. I just thought it was important for us to keep our minds open to the idea of change. And, are we really perfect in that is the system so perfect that we shouldn't try to change it? That was kind of my response to that. It was in no way saying, hey, that actually was a race, like that was super racist. Because how I wasn't prepared to do that. There was, and I shouldn't have been, I shouldn't have had to grow up being my own teacher for these things. I shouldn't have had to grow up trying to reconcile all of these experiences, less than positive, because like looking back, it was abusive and it was, violence. It was verbal violence and sometimes physical violence too. And I think because the first instance of getting kicked by those girls was so intense that anything after that, the name calling, the hair pulling, just felt insignificant. Honestly.
So let me ask you this. So then you went to St. Louis for college, and you mentioned there was a much stronger Black community there. how did you feel? What was your experience in college? How did you feel? Did you become a part of Black community? Did you feel at home there?
Mhm.
Just tell me more about your
Yeah.
experience.
So it was in college that I, well, let me, so we've kind of talked a little bit about my experience in predominantly white culture. I also was having a different experience when I did encounter other Black people. Um, and it was on the totally opposite side. Uh, Whenever I would go over to the area where there's like the mall and a little bit. So like when I say I grew up in a farming community, I mean, really there's nothing there. You have to travel to get to the movies, to the mall, anything that, you know, folks, any entertainment, right? Um, and after I started straightening my hair and going over to these areas where there was also um, going into the Black community, I would have Black women come up and like full on grab a chunk of my hair because they couldn't believe that that was my real hair. Like, surely that wasn't my real hair. And they needed to just see it because it was, and I had gotten that all my life. People want to touch Black women's hair all the time. Just don't do it. It's so wildly inappropriate, and people will ask before they pet a dog, but won't ask before they want to touch your hair. And you shouldn't be asking to touch anybody's hair anyway. But anyways,
I would
and
agree. I would agree with that for
yeah,
sure.
right. And then because of all the subliminal messaging that I had gotten when I was around other Black people, um, and I've talked about this in different blog posts and the unpacking of this because it's quite large and quite heavy. I was afraid of Black people because of the messages I received that Black was bad, that it was different, that it was dumb, that it was less than. I had internalized all of that. Um, Definitely identified more with the white parts of myself. And then when
Interesting.
I was, yeah, and then when I, you know, started coming into more diverse communities, I was fearful and I was apprehensive. So when I decided that I wanted to go to St. Louis University and that I was going to be making this transition to city life, I can't really pinpoint what it was in that transition. Maybe it was the scholarship essays that I was writing that were getting, at the root of who I was and how I think and view the world. But I was letting go of that premise. I was like, okay, I've been socialized to think all of these things about Black people, but um, that's not true. Like, those are stereotypes and those are biases and those are judgments that I'm holding within. And that's a part of me. And if I'm going to, at the very least, accept myself, I have to separate that and acknowledge it, accept it and move forward with it. It's not, when we talk about understanding and accepting parts of ourselves, it's not that we toss it aside or leave it behind. It's that we can accept it and take it with us and move forward in our lives with better understanding of ourselves and hopefully each other. At least that's what I believe. And then I started having a liberal, not a liberal, I started having, St. Louis University is a Jesuit university. They have a mission of service. They want to prepare folks to be for others. Like the idea is that you cultivate this education and you become a man or a woman for others. And then I really started to say, wow, there's so much history. There's so much rich Black history that is a part of me, that is a part of this society that I never learned about, never heard about. So many things that I think are coming to light in today's world, in this seeming moment of racial reckoning. I think we've had a lot of seeming moments of racial reckoning throughout history, and we're at another one. This one feels different. I'd like to believe that it is different. And that was when I started to have pride and started to feel connected to my Blackness. I started claiming my Blackness first and foremost. Up until that point, I would have insisted biracial, mixed. I never would have just said Black, and said Black in a way that was bold and dynamic and beautiful and intelligent, and all these things that I've come to understand Blackness as. That was really, that happened for me in college. And that was the first time that I ever, I remember my first two Black professors and how in awe I was of them and their work. I never had anyone in my life who looked like me, who was leading me or in a leadership role up to that point. So college was just this world of, it was eye-opening, and it was inspiring. And that's really when like I said, I stepped into who I view myself to be today, and away from all of those and all of that internalized oppression, right? Like, there are so many ways that we internalize the oppressive parts of the societies and structures and systems that we participate in. And college was when I really got to say, oh, wow, like, what is all of this? Like, it's not me, it's other folks' perceptions of who I am and how I fit into their world, and it's negative, and I'm holding on to that. So yeah, it was then that I did all these things. And being in classes where we just got to talk about it, where I got to talk about what happened to me in school, where I, for the first time, really, where I got to, be given vocabulary and ways of understanding and thinking about all of these things that just seemed tools for questioning my epistemology, right? How do I know what I know? College was really the place, and I think it is for a lot of people. For me, it was very centric or very focused on my racial identity and the evolution of that. So yeah.
This is great, and I'm like, as you talk, I have so many questions to ask you, but so let me ask you this: are you in touch with your Black side of the family?
No, I am not. I don't know who my father is, and my mother and I haven't had a relationship since maybe I was 4 or 5 years old. So
I see. Let's fast forward to today.
Okay.
And you moved to San Diego. You live in San Diego now. What, like, about daily life and daily encounters? Is there anything that still reminds you that the racism is still there?
yeah, I mean, absolutely. It isn't. So when I was younger, I was experiencing overt forms of racism. Now I experience covert forms of racism.
Can you talk more about those?
Yeah. So with it often is showing up to a room and maybe being the only person of color, maybe being the only woman of color, and yeah, it's in the salience. It's in how, I look at my white peers and I look at our career paths and I look at how much it's just been harder. It's been harder for me to get to where I am, to do the things that I do. One of my favorite not one of my favorite things. It might be I like it, but it might be awkward for other people. Is, you know, people say, "Oh, you moved to San Diego for the sunny weather," and I go, "Yeah," and also I didn't want to die from police brutality in St. Louis, because St. Louis has a terrible problem with police brutality, and it's still heavily segregated. So, like, yes, I'll take the sunshine, but I really am trying to get away from police brutality and segregation. And I was in community development and community empowerment, as I like to put it, when I was in St. Louis as well. And that's not the only reason that I moved out here, but there's just a naivete, I think, about what Black and brown folks have to do to get themselves to where they are. And it's in language, right? Like, just the way, and it's not name calling, but it's microaggressions, right? Like, there are all of these really subtle ways that we can talk about people who are different from us that we think is maybe just a standard way of speaking, and yet, or like, that's just the way it's always been. But there's actually aggression, like, in those types of things. So when I think about racism, I think about structural racism. When I think about racism here in San Diego, because it's not as, you know, it's part of why moving, and I have this conversation with other Black folks who are transplants to San Diego too. We would not be able to do the work that we are doing here in San Diego if we still lived where we came from. We wouldn't have the opportunity. We might not be given the chance. Our foot might not even be able to get in the door. You know, our name isn't a part of the conversation. So it's more in salience of identities and spaces that I experience racism here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So let me shift gears a little bit and follow up on a couple of things that you said before.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I really would like to understand and would love to have your perspective on is, so you mentioned some of this overt racism at school among children, and even though, like, their parents might not have been, well, definitely, you know, tried to go and apologize to your grandmother for
Mm-hmm.
something their kid did, you don't think there's something that the parents they've been teaching them? I mean, I, like, even from my experience, I see when my kids started going to school and some of the things they came back home with, and I was like, where are they getting this from? And so let me ask you this: where do you think this is coming from? Where do you think this is coming from? Where like, children from early age might getting some of this racist habits and so on?
Mm. The one, I don't know that parents are always aware of the ways that they might be communicating that belief or that idea or reinforcing it. So there's a little bit of disconnect from understanding your actions and words as an adult, and maybe the way that kids can pick up on that. There's so much subliminal messaging, and kids are the most receptive to that, even though I think when we think about subliminal messaging and we think about what we're communicating to kids, we think that they're not going to pick up on everything, but they're actually more receptive. So I think parents, one, communicate more than they know. And that's the thing about implicit bias, right? And that's the thing about privilege. You're not supposed to see where you have it. And that's the thing about implicit bias, is you're not supposed to see the way you perpetrate that, or the way that that bias lives within you. Two, stereotyping and bias in the media. Like, there are so many depictions and so many reinforcements on the big screen, news, television, silver screen, etc.,
Yes.
that are reinforcing all that Black is bad, less than, whatever it is that,
This is very true. Very true. Actually, Hilda Mwangi and I had a conversation about this exactly. A very, very interesting point. And especially interesting for people who move to the US from other countries and learn about US from Hollywood movies.
Yes. Yeah. And so, I've lived and worked abroad in the Caribbean for a couple of years, and the conversations, and mind you, I was serving in the Peace Corps when Trump was elected. So that's a whole other conversation. But the perception of America, the image of America that other countries and folks from other nations absorb and take in from the media, from, and the entertainment industry. Like those are the messages we're sending out to the world, and it's the storyline, but it's the implicit, and it's the covert that we're also sending out in those stories. So, yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering why is it been spreading so much amongst children, and how much we as parents have to really be conscious of that and really steer against that and have conversations with our kids so that becomes very, very clear versus like pretending this is not happening and this is just
it's the pretending that it's not happening, and it's also wanting to protect our children and their innocence, and not believing or understanding how they could be ready to have those conversations. It is always the time. Children are always of the age to talk about racism, to talk about sexism, to talk about all of these things that plague our society, that our society is built around, right? And we can't think of it, and I want to correct my language there. These aren't things that are plaguing our society. They're things that our society is built on and built around. So how can we change that if we're not willing to acknowledge that it exists, if we're not willing to educate ourselves on the ways that we can communicate about it, and if we're not willing to let those values come into action? There has to be action around it too. We can't just, children are sponges, and they, think about child development. Children are able to do and move much before they're able to speak. The vocal cords aren't yet developed. So they're already watching our actions and absorbing those actions before they have the ability to speak and maybe mirror in our words. And so I love children. I actually used to be a nanny. I've worked in education. I've been a teacher. And so children are the absolute light of my life. Nothing brings me more joy than being around kids, working with kids. And when I think back to my situation growing up, I have a hard time envisioning, a structure in which we could have been, that the public education system is not set up to have these stories be told, to acknowledge the true history, and to want to move past it and accept and reconcile and regenerate and start, there's no, unless it can be fit in that nice little Black History Month box of these are the people that we're going to talk about, these are the stories that we're going to share, this is the way we're going to look at our history, then it doesn't, all the rest just falls to the wayside. That was the only exposure that I, as a Black child, had to Black culture, Black history. So how can I expect these, how can I expect the teachers to necessarily be above, to have the perspective to know, hey, I should be, the education system just isn't set up for that. And parents aren't prepared to have those conversations. What's been really great is I'm pretty active on Instagram, and there have been a lot of resources being released and guides. And I just saw the other day, I think it was from, can't remember if it was from like a mental health institute or some sort of coalition released a guide for kids and racism. And it's all these different activities
Interesting.
and conversation topics and questions that kids and adults can work through together to start dismantling these systems. But if the school system doesn't see it as a problem, and the teachers don't see it as a problem, and the parents don't see it as a problem, then all of a sudden you have these kids who are representative of, you know, they're reflecting the system, right? You don't have to be taught the racism, and you don't have to be taught the language to discriminate. That it exists in the system, and the children are reflections of that system.
Yeah, this is a very good point. I think this is definitely something we need to pay a lot of attention to. So another thing that I wanted to follow up on of the things that you said was that it hasn't really changed much. When you talked about like partially segregation and you said that there's still a lot of deep-rooted issues and tensions. Can you talk a little bit more about them, just so that to better understand what they are, and maybe we can talk a little bit about what the implications might be.
So in St. Louis, it's called the Delmar Divide. There is, I don't know if you've heard of this, but there is a street, Delmar Boulevard. And to the north is a very, is just to put it very simply, poor, Black, it's a low socioeconomic status. The community is mostly Black. The education level is maybe high school, very limited. Very few folks there have college degrees. The southern part, right, and it's right along this strip, and I've been seeing graphics released on it recently, and I'm glad that it's finally getting the attention that it deserves because it is so prevalent. The bottom half is white, or the southern south of Delmar Divide is white, mostly college educated. The average income is hundreds of thousands of dollars more than the north. So that's like the social breakdown of it. Physically, if you cruise this street, you'll see these large, some of them are spheres, some of them are cylinders, concrete cylinders, to literally just divide, to actually create the divide and separate the two sides of the street. So there's a lot of one ways. It's not easy to get in or out of the north section. And the southern part is very, there's a lot of gentrification. There's a lot of, the schools are, more access for the schools. And so that is how, in college, I was like, oh, wow, here I am in St. Louis that I envisioned to be this multicultural hub. And it is in a lot of ways. There's a large international community there, but it's still segregated. Like, we still have this literal road that you can drive down and see disparity on one side and prosperity on the other. Working with nonprofits, I work a lot in what you would call opportunity zones or promise zones identified by the federal government as being in need of additional resources, funding. And the way that they figure that out is by looking at census tracts and looking at the data provided in census tracts. And there is always, there's always these areas of, I like to refer to them as resilient communities or communities of concern. In the world of development, typically you would think of them as low income, low access. These are the areas that have higher rates of pollution. They're more affected by, climate change and those sort of outcomes. And the demographic information is, looking at it at the map on a map is a great way to sort of is a good intro. It's a nice little snapshot of, okay, wow, this area, let's provide funding to this area because it has all of these things against it, right? Just from a environmental perspective. And then when you dig a little deeper, you find, oh, this is the largest Black population in this region is here. And oh, it is predominantly Black and Hispanic. And it's like, oh, then it's well, how does that happen? It happens through redlining, it happens through policy, it happens through all of these, mechanisms of government and policing that are meant to keep people separate. Divide and conquer is like the oldest tactic in the book. Keep them separate, and then the reason we see it, and then you want to wonder, like, people wonder why we see high rates of crime in these areas, and it's like you have folks who are so cut out, so excluded, so oppressed, who are turning to violence and crime as a means of coping and a means of just surviving and getting through. And I talked about my work in food farming and agriculture sustainability, and typically we would refer, or before we started becoming more empowered in our language, I'm a firm believer that if we can change the way we communicate, that we can change the world. And before we would have looked at this low income, low access area, again, like I said, I like to call them communities of concern, and said, oh, that's a food desert, right? Like there's a lack of access to fresh fruits and vegetables. There's like not a lot of grocery stores, etc. Desert is a natural land feature. The fact that these communities have been excluded and not given access is no accident. It's done so purposefully, and so now we refer to it as food apartheid, because now we're acknowledging the construction, now we're acknowledging the social implication, now we're acknowledging the devastation of this area and its lack of access to resources. And so, there are so many things. I feel like I'm getting a little bit lost on a totally coherent thought, but
I can totally see where you're going with that. Yeah.
And we can look at census tracts and census data and see the segregation and see the disparity and see all of these things that we like to believe, I think, as a nation, that we're beyond, or that we're past, or that we are, wise enough to know the difference and recognize it and move forward. But there's still so much that we have just sort of pushed away, pushed aside. I think, for me, it's about letting the distance between where we are and where we want to be an inspiration, instead of getting so caught up in wanting to believe that we are this beacon of freedom and opportunity. We can be. We really can be. We have the tools. We have the knowledge. We're beginning to communicate, I think, with one another in a way that's helpful for that. But as much as we're responsible for constructing and building the future that we want to see, we also have to be willing to deconstruct and disrupt the systems and policies and attitudes that are in place that keep us from achieving that.
This brings me kind of the next thought of, because what you kind of described is whether there's something inherently constructed in the system, the way the system is constructed, that it kind of puts this divide in place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this brings me to the issue of privilege and the perception of privilege.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking about that in many conversations that I had, and thinking about privilege as not necessarily a zero-sum game. And maybe I'm getting it totally wrong, please. And that's why I want to have your perspective, right?
Sure.
So my view on privilege was, look, it doesn't necessarily make me give up my privilege. I just don't want this to be a privilege at all. I want everybody to enjoy this. So that's not considered privilege. Like, for example, not being brutally treated by police and being treated with respect.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want this to be a privilege. I
Mm-hmm.
just want this to be just that that's the way police treats everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't need to, like, in a way, give up this privilege and being brutally beaten up by the police so that, so you see where I'm going with this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think I'm missing something? And do you think I'm looking at the privilege maybe the wrong way?
Ooh, privilege is a tricky one. I think the attitude that you have of what I have as a privilege should really be a right, right?
Yeah.
Like what you're experiencing as a privilege should really be a right and be the standard.
Yes.
That is that's where we start the work of dismantling racism, and that's where we start the work of dismantling all of these oppressive things. Is we need the people who have the privilege to say this should be a right for everyone, but it has to come from, it has to be this should be a right for everyone. So there's one, the recognition of I have the privilege, right? Like this is a privilege. I don't experience police brutality. Two, this should be a right for everyone. Everyone should be able to experience fair treatment and equitable treatment from our policing system. And then three, and this is where it gets, I think we see a breakdown sometimes. I'm going to do everything in my power or in my privilege to make sure that the privilege I experience has the opportunity to become a right for everyone. And uh, folks have a hard time acknowledging privilege, because I think when people hear the word privilege, sometimes they think it erases their struggle or the challenges that they've faced as a person, because they hold privilege in, and maybe being whites, maybe being male, maybe being heterosexual, and think, well, that shuts down the privilege conversation immediately, because, well, my life, it doesn't mean my life has been hard. The folks from these identity groups are like, well, my life has been hard. I have faced struggle. I've had challenges. That's not what privilege is saying. Privilege is simply saying that you don't have challenge, or that you don't have struggle or face oppression because of the color of your skin or because of these other social identity groups that you belong to. So privilege, you're a bit ahead of the game, because you recognize that you are not ahead of the game. You're on track to start changing and start being an agent for good, because you recognize that you have the privilege, and you say, hey, everyone should have this right. Because when we talk about, if we think about it as a spectrum, there's privilege and there's oppression. And a lot of our experiences as humans fall along that spectrum. And so it's what we do once we, one, if we're able to acknowledge that we have privilege, to say, okay, well, this is what the opposite looks like, right? So in police brutality, I don't want to get too much into what the opposite of police brutality is, because I'm an abolitionist myself, so that's can get a little bit tricky. But recognizing that everybody should have that as a right, like that you having that right, being able to exercise that right healthily and freely is the privilege, and that everyone should have that. And then 3, what you do with that knowledge. Some people sit in guilt, and that's the worst to me. I'm like, oh, like, and I say this, and I think sometimes it sounds a little bit radical. I would rather you feel shame about your privilege than guilt, because the shame is going to get you. You're going to be like, oh, I gotta do something about this. Like, shame is such a motivating. I mean, we see that through history, right? Like, Germany felt shame about the Holocaust, and look at the difference between that and the refusal of shame in American history with the Civil War and the Confederacy. It's like there was no shame there. So like the motivation to change is next to none. So if you're going to feel negative about the privilege, let it take you all the way down to shame, and let that catapult you into, into this arena for change. If you don't feel, and there's some people who feel empowered by the privilege. I have so many friends who are just like, they know that people are reaching out to me for comments, to answer their questions. So they're like, hey, just send them to me. My white friends, they're like, send them over to me. I'll answer the questions. You shouldn't have to deal with that. This is how I'm using my privilege to educate and to help, bring this movement to the forefront, because we're talking about movements here.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting about shame. I would say, at least from my standpoint, maybe it's like its stronger sense towards injustice. Like when you see it's injustice, at least from my standpoint, it's not necessarily shame that much, but I can totally see your point. And
it's got to be something strong. My point is that it has to be beyond the guilt,
I think it's like when you see injustice around you, I think it's important to do something about it, right? And it's important to do something about it for the same very reason as I was interviewing Charles McPherson, and he reminded me of that old saying, can't remember who it was attributed to, that when they went after Jews, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Jew. When they went after, somebody else, and then they came for me, right? And there was nobody left to say anything. So it's kind of the same thing. When you see injustice around you, you got to say something or do something about it, because at some point of time, they're going to come for you, and there's going to be nobody left around. I think to me, this is a very strong message, and I also very much agree with you that it's got to drive to action. You cannot just sit on this knowledge. We covered quite a bit of ground. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about racism among children. We talked about just recently about privilege. We talked about what hasn't changed and what causes the segregation to this day. What haven't we talked about? What do you think that we should have talked about?
We touched a little bit on internalized oppression, but I think there's just so much. Oh goodness, there's just so much more there, especially in this time. And I think about this in the social media landscape and what people are sharing and what information folks are trying to put out there. And I see so many, and mostly from my background in a, somewhat Southern conservative place. And they, they want to show these Black folks who have internalized the racism and oppression going on this long rant or tangent that supports the way that these conservative counterparts are thinking, right? Like, and I see so much, and the reason internalized oppression, I think, is hard to talk about, and it's so large and needs to be talked about more, is because there's the ways I think about the way I harbored it, right? Like thinking differently and less of Black people growing up. I see these examples of like, white conservatives posting these Black folks who are just degrading and like ripping into the culture to like try and like support their point. And then I think of it in terms of symptoms and mechanisms of white supremacy that they're harder to pinpoint, because it's like the way that we talk in our language, the way that we, you know, view ourselves, and things like productivity. You know, white supremacy manifests in either or thinking, right? That it has to be one or the other, that there is no yes and both. And that paradigm, the paradigm we find ourselves in today, a white supremacist paradigm, is always this or that. It's black or white, it's up or down, it's rich or poor. It's all of these like very polarized ways of thinking, and that our identities have become polarized. So really, when we have so much in common, so much beauty and relatability in this human experience, that has become politicized and that has become polarized. And so when we talk about internalized oppression, we can start to talk about dismantling those white supremacist systems that force us into all of these extremities, or force us to have to pick some of these extremities, when really life is the gray area. Life is falling along those spectrums, and our relatability and our ability to connect with one another is in that gray area that doesn't necessarily always have language, that doesn't always necessarily have tangibility. I don't think as a society we necessarily foster creativity and imagination as much as we could and should. And you know, this goes back to my love for children. We have got to have an active imagination. We have got to be creators in some way if we're going to imagine the world. And I close my eyes when I say this. If we're going to imagine the world where everybody has a seat at the table, where everybody has a voice, where everybody can be honored for who they are and how they show up, that requires a very active imagination. And the polarities and all of these things that we have to sift through as humans, it takes up so much of our time and energy, that imaginative piece that we need to really, you know, rise up and grow together. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the centerpiece in society that I hope and know that it can have, but we're not quite there yet. So, you know, imagination and creativity are so important along this journey as well.
I could not agree more. And I think this is a perfect message to wrap up our conversation. Thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed this.
Thank
This
you.
was awesome.
Yeah,
So
thank you for having me. This was great.